David, have you ever been to Shawnee Mission Park in Johnson County?
I have not, Celia, but I do love parks. I've been to many parks, just not that one.
Well, you're missing out. It's a fabulous park. And when I go to the park, I am generally there to enjoy the scenery.
Climb in from either side.
During a recent spring, I headed out to the burbs of Kansas City to hop on a UTV.
All right, on top.
And check out some very special, very pretty scenery. But the thing about this was it was actually an environmental threat disguised as beautiful scenery.
Oh, yeah, they're really obvious and they're really big.
Yeah, people actually come out here and take Instagram shots.
Okay, so that's Matt Garrett, and he is the biologist and the natural resource manager for Johnson County Park and Recreation District. And this park, God, it has to be the most visited park in all of Kansas.
It's the most direct access to wild spaces that people have on this side of the Kansas City region.
And a big reason that people come here every April is specifically what I came to see. This road that is lined with dozens of 30 to 40 foot tall trees that were just like covered in white blooms. Very scenic.
And I'd assume about 35 years ago, someone decided that this would be a gorgeous, blooming species to plant along the entry to the theater.
To be fair, they weren't wrong. They're in full bloom right now and kind of creating this arch over the road.
Right.
It's really pretty.
Right, and it's pretty until you smell them.
Okay, so now I know what you're talking about, Celia. Those are Bradford pear trees. And I know that smell, too. It's not good.
Yeah, that's kind of a giveaway, right? Okay, so David, how would you describe the smell of Bradford pears?
So probably the most polite description would be something like rotting fish, maybe?
I think that probably is the most polite description. People have less polite descriptions. But admittedly, the not so pleasant smell is not the reason that Johnson County Park and Rec is trying to get rid of this thing.
Right, because they're invasive.
Yes, exactly. These are invasive trees. So when I visited, the crew had already killed about, maybe 20 of them. Boom, dead. As for the rest of them, their days were numbered.
From the Kansas News Service and KCUR studios, you're listening to Up From Dust,
a podcast about the environmental price of trying to shape the world around us, told through the lens of Kansas, a state where I live and see a lot of these environmental changes on full display.
But this show isn't just bad news about climate and the environment, we promise. Because this show is also about meeting Kansans who are rolling up their sleeves to find less damaging, more sustainable ways to fix our generational mistakes. I'm David Condos.
And I'm Celia Yopis Jepson. In recent centuries, humans have been carrying species around the globe and introducing them to new places like never before. Plants, fish, fungi. Most of the time, it's not clear that the newcomers cause any trouble, but some species end up so massively successful in their new surroundings that they cut into the food web.
So today, we're talking about those, the invasive ones. And we'll meet the people who are running full tilt at the problem with city codes, machetes, and salad forks. We can't close Pandora's box, but we might be able to restore balance in some places to help native biodiversity weather the storm.
All right, so back to Johnson County, which, by the way, is the richest county in Kansas. If you haven't been there, picture suburbia, manicured lawns, neatly trimmed hedges.
Little boxes on the hillside.
And those Bradford pear trees, also called calorie pears and a dozen other names, fit right into that picture. Mm-hmm. They're showy in the spring and fiery red in the fall.
And calorie, Callery, that's the species name. They are just like what homeowners love, right? So the issue is you put them in your yard because they're beautiful, but they don't stay in your yard. They start spreading right into the parks, the woods, the prairies. Here in Kansas, they're growing wild in at least half of our counties. And Johnson County Parks and Rec, they're so worried about this species that they're spending taxpayer money to kill as many of these trees as possible on public land.
Yeah, and I can't help but point out the irony here. So you've got these homeowners that are shelling out money for saplings at stores, planting them in their pristine yards, and then they're paying Parks and Rec to almost be like pest exterminator, hunting these trees down later on public land.
Yeah, exactly. It is ironic. So when I visited Shawnee Mission Park, another one of the workers I spoke to was Matt Deere.
So I'm going to be kind of corny for a minute and quote the Lorax. Unless somebody like you cares a whole awful lot, it's not going to get better. It's not.
So, David, do you know this book, Dr. Seuss, The Lorax?
Oh, yeah, of course. It's classic.
I just have to ask, is this a book you've ever read to your kids?
I have. Yeah.
What did they think of it?
I mean, they hear me talk about this stuff a lot, so it was not necessarily new to them. I think it seemed pretty natural. It's like, oh, yeah, there's also a cartoon talking about we should save nature. Yeah.
Yes, I am the Lorax who speaks for the trees.
Oh, that's really sweet. Okay, so you know this book well. Just for anyone who doesn't, the Lorax is this squat, furry, orange character. And basically, yeah, he warns us not to destroy the environment. And he also urges us to start repairing the damage that we've already done, kind of like Matt is doing. But it's hard work. I watched Matt attack these calorie pear saplings with a machete. His coworker Drew Dabalier took a chainsaw to the bigger ones.
I love my job. In order to leave what we have for the next generation and beyond, we need to help clean up the mess we started so that we can have our nice natural areas.
Is it at all therapeutic to cut down a calorie pear?
Some days, yes. It depends on how much energy you've got. I mean, if you got a lot of energy and some frustrations, take a machete and chop it and put some chemical on it.
So a lot of tree species would die at this point, but calorie pears are so stubborn. So Matt and Drew, they have to carry this little bottle of tree poison around with them and squeeze it onto the trunk very carefully, just inside the bark after they hack it open.
There we go. I'd say in a couple weeks to a month or two, that tree will eventually die.
Goodbye, pear tree.
Good riddance.
April is perfect pear hunting season for these guys.
Because they can spot the white flowers, right?
Yeah, exactly, because of the white flowers. So that's pretty handy when you're searching for these trees throughout a 2,000-acre park on a UTV.
We saw a pear hiding up here in a tree line. You see the white bloom popping out of the landscape there?
This pear has really gone to great lengths to hide from you guys.
So how many of these pear trees have they cut down in Shawnee Mission Park?
They guess maybe 500 mature trees and loads more baby ones. Too many to count. After a day like this, they start to feel pretty good. But then they leave the park, and David, that feeling doesn't last.
And then you go to the grocery store on your lunch break, and there's 4 calorie pears for sale.
Oh, ouch.
Yeah, a lot of the places that sell calorie pears are big national chains, big hardware stores.
Yeah, that has to be such a downer for these people to see folks out there buying and planting these trees after they've done all this work.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's total 1 step forward, 2 steps back.
Yeah, and they've come to realize that their work to control invasive species at Shawnee Mission Park will never truly be finished. But what will help them is that Kansas just passed a ban on selling these trees, which follows in the footsteps of states like Ohio and Pennsylvania. But the rule doesn't take effect until 2027. Now, in Missouri, lawmakers are considering a law to control these trees, but no action yet. The thing is, the more these trees spread, the more they squeeze out the native plants. And then that means less food for caterpillars and baby birds, and it all affects the food web.
Okay, so Celia, break this down for me. What makes these calorie pear trees so bad?
First, let's back up and talk about why plants rock. They soak up energy from outer space.
The magic of photosynthesis, right?
Exactly. How damn lucky are we that something on this giant hunk of rock hurtling through outer space figured out, hey, how about intercepting sunlight from outer space and making my own dinner? The rest of us can't pull that trick, so we depend on plants to share that love, right? Pass along that energy. So, like simply put, we need plants to be edible because it supports the food chain. But some invasive species, they're not really like team players anymore because they're not very edible in the places that we've moved them to. And that is having big impacts. There's a famous bug scientist, Douglas Tallamy at the University of Delaware, who's like finally making this click for people and helping them understand why this matters.
Please help me give a warm Wisconsin welcome to Dr. Doug Tallamy.
Nobody's done more to inspire people to make these changes in their yards than Doug Tallamy. I call him the guru of backyard biodiversity. Doug, I hope you're okay with that.
Man, these guys are getting people fired up. This is like, are you ready to rumble with some invasive plants?
He's kind of like a rock star in a very nerdy world. So Tallamy and his students went out into hedgerows that were full of invasive species like calorie pears, and they found that 90% of the caterpillars had disappeared. The caterpillars can't eat those plants, but loads of caterpillars eat the native plants that they displaced. Now, think of the implications for the rest of the food chain, like birds.
How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of Carolina chickadees? 1 or 2 is not enough.
Tallamy makes it really clear. Like a chickadee has got to scrounge up thousands of insects to successfully feed a single clutch of chicks.
And so if a bunch of insects start disappearing from that forest because they can't eat the plants...
Right. The bird population takes a hit.
So we need to raise the bar about what we're asking our landscapes to do. In the past, we've asked them to do one thing. They got to be pretty. Okay. We're not going to give that up. They're still going to be pretty, but now we have to make pretty landscapes that are ecologically functional.
Okay, but what makes these species so inedible to insects? Like, why can't they eat them?
It's all about context. It's not that calorie pears are like innately bad or something. It's just that the caterpillars here, where we have them now, haven't evolved to eat those leaves. Tallamy says insects got thousands of years of evolving with the plants that they currently know and love. And that's key because like evolving to eat a plant seems to be super hard. Plants pack their leaves with all kinds of bad tasting and like toxic chemicals specifically to shake off these insects. It's not really clear like how long it will take our insects to learn to eat plants from totally different places.
Yeah, so just one of these new invasive species can have all these sorts of ripple effects.
Species have always moved around on this planet. It's just that never have so many cropped up in new places so fast. We move some species on purpose. We move lots of them, honestly, by accident. And we just don't know in advance, like which ones will play nice, which ones will be a big problem.
This reminds me of the old world bluestem, this grass that came from Europe and Asia, and people and the government planted it in Kansas as the state recovered from the Dust Bowl. And they thought this is a great thing. This plant can hold the soil in place, but now decades later, it's turned out the old world bluestem way outcompetes the North American bluestems and other native plants in the prairie. And so some of the landowners and scientists I've talked to in western Kansas about this, it just breaks their heart because this plant is taking over big swaths of prairie and there's not much they can do about it.
And not all of the disruptive species are even plants.
Right. There's invasive fish in our streams, invasive insects in our woods. The emerald ash borer is wiping out trees by the millions all across the U.S.
And some of this damage to ecosystems, we simply can't stop that. But that doesn't mean that there aren't things that we can do. So the crew working at Shawnee Mission Park, for example, they are making progress year by year, removing calorie pear trees, invasive bush honeysuckle, and that's helping to make sure that native plants and insects and birds will continue to have a home on those 2,000 acres. Now, most of Kansas, David, you probably know this, is privately owned, right? It's owned by private individuals, not by your municipality, your county, the state of Kansas or something. So private landowners are a big part of this puzzle. The more that they can also start seeing their property as ecosystems, the better off that scientists say we will be. In terms of suburbia, every little suburban lot can fuel the food web if we want it to.
It's really just our own patch of habitat right here in Overland Park.
That's Ginger Werp. She lives on a typical residential street in Johnson County, But she's turned part of her yard into a mini chunk of meadow, and she's excited about the creatures she sees.
A lot of species of native bees. We get yellow swallowtail butterflies. We have a fox, a groundhog. You can see there's little rabbit holes in there.
Wait, so she's getting foxes and groundhogs in her yard? That is wild to me. I have never seen a fox or groundhog in my neighborhood.
I know, right? Like right in the middle of the second biggest city in Kansas. So Ginger is part of an international groundswell of public interest in native plant gardening. The idea of bringing back each region's native plants to places that have become pretty devoid of insects and birds and other life. But admittedly, not all of her neighbors like that meadow look. So one day, someone from the city showed up and told Ginger to rip out some of the plants, something which made absolutely no sense to her or to her son, Oliver Hernandez, who is in middle school.
Yeah, that's what I don't understand either. I don't get why they had to cut it down.
Ginger thinks maybe someone on her street complained because they worried this meadow look would hurt their property values.
I've had some uncomfortable conversations with neighbors about it, but it doesn't bother me because I like it. I like the way this looks. I think it's pretty. I think it's fun.
I could definitely see how this native plant movement might push the envelope a little in a place like Overland Park.
These animals and plants were here for a long time before we were, and we're the reason their numbers are declining. They don't have enough habitat to survive. They can't live off green manicured lawns and pine bushes year-round. And when you look around, that's all we see.
I bet for a lot of people, doing stuff like this is almost a form of therapy. Like, we live in a scary world. The climate is changing, insects are declining, species are going extinct, and understandably, people have a need to see some kind of progress, to see more life flourish.
That's exactly the way to put it.
I have purple coneflower, butterfly milkweed, purple poppy mallow.
And when you plant all these things, wildlife show up to this buffet pretty fast.
The birds love it in the winter. Like, as you can see, all the seeds have already been picked out of these.
This is like your bird feeder.
Yes, and it's easy because you don't have to refill it.
And she loves seeing her son enjoy this little meadow. Oliver, he's into science. He likes being outdoors. He wants to be a paleontologist someday.
I mean, me and my friends also a lot of times just like come out here and just try to find a lot of bugs and just like play around with them.
One of the coolest things in his garden probably has to be the monarch caterpillars.
Also, whenever they become butterflies, they fly to Mexico. I think that's pretty cool.
I can relate to this because my 8-year-old son also wants to be a paleontologist. So I can totally envision, a kid out there in the yard digging around.
You know what this is like then. He likes to be outdoors. He likes science. So like I said, they're really into this garden. But I dropped by their house after a city worker actually made them rip out some of the plants. So specifically, they had to rip out the common milkweed because of a city ban on that species, which, gets a bad rap as kind of weedy, I guess.
Yeah, and, see, that blows my mind because, I don't know a ton about plants, but I have heard that, these monarchs are struggling and they really need this milkweed to reproduce.
That's the plant, right? It's the milkweed that's the one that the monarchs come for. So after Oliver and Ginger spoke out publicly about this, Overland Park did change its rules. And other cities across the country are kind of going through something similar right now, where they've been dropping rules that can get you in trouble for growing native plants.
Yeah, so that seems like a good sign.
Yeah, and Overland Park's changes are interesting because they didn't just unban milkweed. They rewrote the code to promote native species as beneficial to Overland Park and to discourage invasive plants. Now, I don't know how this is going to shake out long term in terms of actual enforcement in Overland Park, but under this new code, there could potentially be penalties when people let those invasive plants get out of control on their properties.
All right, so there's one thing I've been wondering about this, Celia. What about the cost? Imagine you're a homeowner and you want to get rid of a calorie pair in your yard. You get an estimate and it could cost a few $100, a few $1,000 to remove it. And so maybe you're just not going to do that. That could make the difference between somebody doing it or not.
Yeah.
And then when you're talking about local governments, like at parks and stuff, Johnson County Parks and Rec may have the time and money to tackle this, but I bet a lot of other local agencies don't have that luxury.
Oh, absolutely. They do not. I mean, no agency has enough money. The issue is so big, but certainly some more than others. And that is why a lot of communities are grateful when volunteers come in and pick up the work. Nonprofit groups take a lot of this work on their shoulders.
Let's get this brick.
I'm talking determined neighbors, people like Esmeralda Zapata.
I like farming, gardening, touching the dirt. That's my thing. I don't know, every time I smell dirt, I'm like, thank God.
Brick. I want it. Brick.
Esmeralda joined a local group of teenagers in Kansas City, Kansas, called the Green Team. It's part of a local nonprofit called the Groundwork Northeast Revitalization Group. And these teens are making it happen.
All my calluses are already such calluses, they don't matter anymore.
They give some much-needed TLC to neglected lots, or they add or improve green spaces in low-income neighborhoods where racism and lack of private and public investment continue to put the area at a disadvantage. Many of the residents here are Black, Hispanic, or multiracial. We caught up with them in the historically redlined Turtle Hill neighborhood.
We're building a trail and then eventually a patio. I'm very excited for all this stuff. And now it's a space to hang out.
In a lot of Kansas City, Kansas, there's way too much concrete and not enough just nice green outdoor places for people to enjoy. Esmeralda wants to change that.
I feel like because where we live, we don't get the amount of funding that other places do, mainly because, we're poor, I guess.
Maida Townsend lives nearby and helps Groundwork Energy with projects like these.
I think there are really a lot of overlapping crises. It's disenfranchisement and disinvestment for so long. The people here have such a low median income, they can barely keep up their own property, much less deal with the issues of climate change, of watershed problems, of pollution, of invasive species.
So a lot of these green spaces have an impact on climate change, which is a real thing. A lot of people don't like to say it's a real thing, but climate change is happening.
Green spaces full of native plants and trees and not just lawn help with summer heat. They absorb air pollution, they absorb stormwater, and they feed wildlife.
Oh my goodness, it is so important. Just by the simple fact of it's just the circle of life.
That's Esmeralda's brother, Gerardo.
My favorite native plant for Kansas is the butterfly milkweed. We planted so many in our lots. I see tons and tons of butterflies like just swarming around the area.
To Oliver Faulkner, another member of the team, that makes it so much better than, say, just adding some lawn or something.
Because you can just plant a few plants and say it's green, but if it's not actually being used by the nature around it, kind of is just the same, doing the same thing as a building would.
But a frustrating thing, they run into so many invasive species while doing this work, which slows things down.
I don't know, when I was a kid, I thought of honeysuckle as like nice. And then I found out it's killing all these other plants. And I was like, dang.
If these invasive species keep going through, just ravaging through the neighborhoods and everything, just killing all these native plants, all this wildlife is just going to end up dying out. We'll lose so much. It's just a whole chain of things that just really starts with invasive plants.
The thing about invasives is they're deceptive, right? You can look around and see everything is green and think, oh, this is a healthy landscape.
Yeah, and that's what I was thinking when Oliver mentioned the honeysuckle there. That's one I've seen a lot in the places I've lived, and I know it can look really, really green, but it's also, this rambunctious invasive that can take over the understory of a forest, for example.
Oh, man. Sometimes when I'm hiking in the Kansas City area, all I see is a wall of honeysuckle, and I cannot even see into the woods.
Which may seem normal if you grew up with it. But, thinking back decades ago, the forest floor probably looked a lot different with a mix of a bunch of other plants like wildflowers.
And around Kansas City, many of those forest wildflowers are disappearing. So Gerardo says there's just one thing to do to build healthy habitats, fight climate change, tackle pollution, and that is get to work.
So it's as simple as that. If you're doing anything, any kind of change, any kind of work, that's good enough. It is so tiring, but once you honestly take a step back when you're done, it is the most like refreshing, relieving, and like just a feeling of achievement.
There are literally tens of thousands of recorded non-native species introductions worldwide. And we keep adding more. Scientists say it's actually getting faster. It's contributing to extinctions. Globally, they're calling for a lot more prevention work, policy changes that could help. And it is easy to hear this and to feel overwhelmed and not do anything. But that's why Gerardo's advice is such good advice.
Yeah, and I totally get it. Like thinking, well, if I change the plants in my little yard, that's not going to make that much of a difference. But if nobody does that, then nothing changes.
So the point here is do what you can do, whatever dent you can make in this issue. So I want to introduce you to someone who's making her own dent by teaching the public to recognize and deal with invasive species. I met up with her at Wyandotte County Lake Park.
Hey, how are you doing this morning?
Good. Happy to be out here instead of in the office.
Amy Bausman is an educator for the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks.
I teach people how to forage, fish, and hunt responsibly, respectfully, ethically for sustainability purposes.
Forage. So we're talking about eating food now?
Yeah. So she taught me how to eat invasives.
Okay. Wow. Okay. I did not think that this was where it was going to go.
All right. Yes. And a small caveat here first. Like, obviously, we're not saying that eating invasives is a magic solution that is going to make this whole huge problem go away. And a lot of invasives like bush honeysuckle are not edible for humans. They're actually mildly toxic. But I love what Amy does because this is all about public awareness and education. That is part of the solution.
Pretty much right now, all the green you can see along the tree border is bush honeysuckle.
I think like to the left of the path here, it might have a little more like silvery blue to it instead of like the bright green.
That's your autumn olive. You passed the test. That's it. What makes them appear kind of what you said peachy are these tiny little dots all over the berries. You see those? Do you want to try one?
I definitely want to try one.
Note to listeners, don't eat berries in the woods unless you know what you're eating.
Do not. Wise words.
They are kind of sweet, subtle. What do they remind me of? A plum. Is that weird?
You get that like little burst of pulp. My favorite thing to do is to make a barbecue sauce out of them and serve that with wild rabbit. That's one of my favorite
barbecue sauce
combos.
with wild rabbit. That sounds fancy.
Yeah, it is kind of fancy.
Well, maybe I'm just going to pick a few more since there are so many more up here. So that, I gotta say, is the advantage maybe of learning to forage invasive species. You don't have to responsibly limit yourself to eating a certain amount. You could go crazy.
Really good. With regular foraging with native species, the general rule is only pick from a patch that is well developed, and you don't take more than 20% of what's there. With this, you could pick it clean.
And ideally, she says, you'd kill the autumn olive bush after picking the berries, but remember, you'll need landowner permission.
You travel around and you teach people to eat invasive species, and this is just one of them. Can you tell me a little bit about the other, what are your favorite invasive species that you like teaching people to eat in Kansas?
Wild garlic mustard is invasive, and in the spring, I make a wonderful pesto out of it.
Yeah, I'm a garlic fan myself, Celia. What does this taste like?
Partly garlicky, also kind of horseradishy. It's great in salads, I've heard. It adds a kick of flavor. People make chimichurri out of this stuff. Or here's another one. You know about invasive carp?
I did. I've seen that video. They're pretty intense.
Yeah. So if you have not, go to YouTube and look. These are those fish that you see in videos leaping into people's boats or even slamming into them.
Look at them go!
You can totally eat it They're carp balls, which sounds like a funny name, but they're breaded and fried and delicious.
Amy has even used invasive fish as eco-friendly hog food. And also, she says you can bury them in your backyard for fertilizer.
There's a Rosa multiflora, so this is a Chinese rose.
You can eat that?
Yeah, there were lots of bright red rose hips on them, the fruits.
It's got a little bit of tanginess to it. Pretty delicious.
Super high in vitamin C. They make a lovely tea. You can put them in soups.
At one point, I asked Amy how she feels about the fact that the woods have changed so much since she was a kid. And she gave me a really great answer.
You know, sometimes I have the sense of urgency and overwhelm about it, but I think that my personal life practice is that I don't have control over it. So I'm not going to let it control me.
I went through a period where I actually stopped hiking. It kind of ruined the experience for me. Instead of feeling like I was surrounded by green, I felt like I was surrounded by this change that was like undoing everything for the birds that I like to see and everything. And I wonder if you had that experience and like how you've kind of managed to kind of break through to the other side.
So I think that us as a human species, as our landscape changes, we have to learn to adapt. And if you avoid these spaces, you can't learn from them. You can't learn how to change and grow with them by avoiding them, right? I mean, we definitely need to continue advocating for eradicating as many of these invasive species as possible. Definitely. I just think that if we have a bit of a perspective shift in how we approach it, then we can save ourselves a lot of emotional damage through anger and resentment.
Up From Dust is a production of the Kansas News Service and KCUR Studios in Kansas City. The Kansas News Service, by the way, is a kick-ass collaborative made of NPR stations: KMUW, Kansas Public Radio, High Plains Public Radio, and KCUR. We cover a wide range of health and policy issues. This episode was written and reported over the past 2 years by me, Celia Yopis-Jepsen, the environmental reporter for the Kansas News Service. My co-host is my former Western Kansas colleague, David Condos, who now covers the environment for KUER in Utah. Mackenzie Martin is our senior producer, and I am bonkers grateful for that. We had editorial support from Scott Cannon at The Beacon and Suzanne Hogan. This episode was mixed by me, Mackenzie Martin, and Byron Love. Additional production help from interns David McKeel and Anna Schmidt. Our logo is by Jessica Corneliuson. Special thanks this episode to Blaise Mesa for contributing reporting from Kansas City, Kansas, in addition to Gabe Rosenberg, Stephen Coranda, Genevieve Demarteau, and Stephanie Kuo and Mike Russo at PRX. You heard clips from the 1972 film The Lorax, in addition to several public speeches Douglas Tallamy has given. Music this episode by Malvina Reynolds and Blue Dot Sessions. Additional music, including our theme song and this song you're hearing right now, are provided by our very own David Condos and Tom Lonnie and Milktooth. If you want to learn more about invasive species or about gardening with native plants, we'll post resources at kcur.org/upfromdust. I'd love to hear what you thought of this episode. You can shoot me an email at celia@kcur.org. If you like the show, please consider writing us a review or sharing it with a friend. We'll be back in your feeds again soon with an episode about what's ailing the Great Plains prairies and the people who have a plan to save them. Thanks for listening.